Moshi Moshi.
Hello,
I'm Zeb Ramsbotham,
and I'm Annie Ramsbotham.
and we're the Rambling Ramsbothams.
Our journey might be rambling, but we hope this podcast isn't.
So welcome to another episode, and what are we talking about today?
We're talking about pizza in Japan, pass hunting, and bicycle history. And in our notes, it's the first episode after Zeb's birthday, and he wrote, I have very high expectations.
Oh, I mean, doesn't everyone?
Well, how was your birthday? Did it meet your very high expectations?
Yeah, it was okay.
It was okay.
Yeah, it was decent.
Well, one of the things that we had on his just okay birthday was pizza. And
We had pizza the night before my birthday.
That's true, because your birthday was on a Sunday, so you said you wanted to have birthday dinner on a wild Saturday night.
Yeah, just because, sometimes I like my Sunday night, because, it's the night before I go back to work.
Yeah.
I just like to have,
Chill.
Not too much going on. So I thought it'd be nice if we could have some kind of dinner or something on Saturday night.
Yeah. And you were feeling cozy. It's pretty cold and gross outside. It's been a wet cold recently where it's raining, but not cold enough to be snow.
Yeah, we're finally on
sleeting.
The cusp of freezing weather. We finally have temperatures in freezing or just below freezing. So we've had a lot of sleet, borderline hail, and it's supposed to maybe kind of snow, but most of the time it's just been the worst kind of rain, the barely freezing.
But what's cozier than having pizza inside on a rainy, gross day? So that's what we were doing.
If we had a fireplace, that really would have tied the room together.
Zeb really likes fireplaces.
Yeah.
But I was ordering, we were looking at options online. I know that being in a different country, you have to adapt your ideas of what certain things are to what that country is.
Mm-hmm.
And pizza's one of those things. Of course I can't compare everything to American food, but we do miss American food, and I think of pizza as being a fairly American thing, especially a brand like Domino's that, is an American company.
Yeah.
Kind of like McDonald's came from America, so you expect to find close enough things. I know they have different things on the menu, but you can probably always find a Big Mac no matter what country you're in.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting because even in Europe, the taste, the palate is similar enough that you can find very similar tastes.
Mm-hmm.
And America is such a global country. You can find a variety of tastes. But even
because
in
it's
Europe,
made up of people whose heritage are from different countries.
Yeah, and then in a big city you can find really authentic food, and you can find authentic food here in Japan. But I think on a national scale in Japan,
Mm-hmm.
because they're selling it to very not ethnically diverse population that
Mm-hmm.
most people in Japan are Japanese, they really cater a lot of the foods to the palate of Japan.
Yeah.
So it's very different where in Europe they kind of share a similar palate to America. And so a lot of the flavors are similar, but in Japan the palate is so different.
Yeah, usually what we find with pizza specifically, it's there's either Japanese taste preferences flavoring the pizza, or it's super traditional Italian style pizza. I've had really good Italian pizza.
Or they really go off the wall.
Off the wall.
Yeah, remember the American pizza we saw? And it was French fries and hot dogs.
Yeah, it was called
on
American pizza, but it literally had French fries that they threw on the pizza.
And hot dogs.
And chopped up some,
Yeah. So
Yeah,
sometimes they'll have stuff like that
very
where
interesting.
It's the idea of a country, but they don't really they don't really get it.
Maybe it was, just trying to be funny. Maybe it would be good to put French fries on a pizza and call it American pizza.
Yeah, I don't know. But sometimes it's funny because you'll miss the mark where, we joke about, or I joke about how we eat a lot of cheese here in Japan, but it's Japanese cheese, which is very different globally from European and American cheese. So I always joke that Japanese people are probably man, cheese is terrible. Why do people eat this? And it's because they eat Japanese cheese.
Maybe they like that kind of cheese and they just keep making it because it sells and people, your tastes adapt to what you're used to, I think.
I hope my taste does not adapt to Japanese cheese, because that would be such a heartbreak to then go back and eat real cheese.
I've been to some really good pizza places in Japan that are not what I think of as trashy American pizza. When you want just some sloppy, cheap, greasy pizza.
Well, that's the thing that people don't understand. A lot of, and this is a bigger deal, but...
Are you about to get on a soapbox about
a little bit. So globally,
pizza?
people don't understand in America, we have all levels of everything. So yeah,
Do we?
sometimes you just want cheap, nasty, gross, greasy pizza. But then sometimes, yeah, you want like nice pizza, so you go to like a nice wood fire oven restaurant. But we have like the full spectrum of pizza. So
I've found the full spectrum in Japan. Like I've had really good Italian pizza, but it's not the type of American pizza.
Have you seen a good frozen pizza in Japan?
Well, we don't have a Costco membership, so apparently that's where you're supposed to get.
In an American store. So
Anyway, I thought let's get some American-esque pizza from Domino's. And then when we were ordering, there was some interesting differences that I thought maybe we should tell you guys about in case you've not had the opportunity to buy Domino's or, delivery type pizza in Japan. They did have a, quote, American pizza that was just pepperoni pizza.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was kind of funny that was the American pizza. But a lot of the pizza will have things that I didn't grow up seeing as common toppings, like corn, asparagus, clams, mayonnaise, which I actually like mayonnaise on pizza, squid.
Yeah, they do a lot of seafood pizza.
And every pizza on the Domino's website had meat on it, unless it was just cheese or margarita.
Yeah, I think the only one that didn't have meat on it that was like a pizza that you could order. There was, of course, cheese pizza, and then there was margarita. And even like the chef's specialty vegetable pizza had ham.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like...
It's kind of a bummer if you're a vegetarian. But
and the vegetables, the selection of vegetables in Japan for pizzas, even on the build your own, significantly worse than America.
Well, it's just worse to you. Some people in America are probably like, where's the corn and the asparagus for my pizza?
You think so?
I don't know.
Freaks.
That's harsh. But the Quattro Nippon was a type of pizza, and it was 4 flavors on one pizza. One corner had charcoal grilled chikiteri, like chicken teriyaki, I guess. The other corner had Hokkaido 3 cheese with rich cream sauce. The other one was spicy mayo and mochi, which I don't like spicy food, but I like mochi. That sounds pretty interesting. And then char grilled beef. So we didn't get the Quattro Nippon because it was a little too adventurous for what Zeb was feeling.
Well, not even adventurous. It's like, I have gone back. We joke a lot on this that we're like reformed vegetarians. But I really have, especially in the past like few months, I feel like have been predominantly eating vegetarian again. So I've really been shying away from ordering anything that has like
there was just a lot of meat. You didn't want to get the giga meat?
Yeah, so that was another one we saw, and there was the giga meat, which was... Yeah, I don't need the giga meat.
You can get different like toppings on the pizza or side sauces kind of things for the pizza, which was interesting. Like maple sauce would actually sounds pretty good for cheese pizza, like some sweet and salty. Mm-hmm. And you can get seaweed flakes if you're into that. It is like much more expensive than American cheap pizza. Like if you're looking for just cheap pizza and you're not trying to go to a fancy place, it's hard to find cheap pizza in Japan. So each pizza, like for a small pizza, was between 2,300 and 4,500 yen.
And by small, they mean small.
Like almost personal size.
Yeah, like kind of like the kids' size. And even a medium, we ordered one medium, and it was kind of like, oh.
Yeah, but with the caveat that even though they're between 2,300 to 4,500 yen, they're almost always running like half off sales.
For carry out.
Yeah.
If you order online and pick it up.
So it's always on sale, but it's still more expensive. So we bought one huge pizza that was on this massive sale, and then a medium build your own kind of margarita type pizza. And neither of them had any meat. It was just like, one was just plain cheese, and the other was tomatoes, garlic, onions. And we spent 3,700 yen, and I picked it up. You don't have to do a tip, which is nice coming from America. But 3,700 yen is $26 for 2 pizzas, which, I mean, if you were to go to...
And one was probably the equivalent of like a small, and then the other one was like a true American large. But it was funny because in the Japanese marketing, they were like, this is an obscenely large pizza.
It did feel obscenely large compared to the others.
Compared to the medium.
But yeah, 3,700 on 2 pizzas, and compared to like a Little Caesars pizza in America, I think they're still doing like $6 hot and ready cheese pizzas.
Yeah, maybe with inflation it might be a little bit more. I don't really...
Those are like 850 yen. So it's like at least 3 times the price.
Yeah, but see, that's what I'm saying about if there are people out there that see that Little Caesars hot and ready, and then they're like, yeah, Americans, they just sell you cardboard for pizza. It's all they got over there.
Well, that is one type of very popular
exactly,
pizza.
Yeah. It's like sometimes you're just in a situation where you just want a cheap piece of pizza.
Well, that's Zeb's rant about pizza.
Yeah, sorry. going off the rails about I just really like pizza. And so
I just really like pizza.
Yeah, pizza's like family. It's like warm and cozy. Makes you feel good when you eat it.
Wow.
It was last year we went to the nice pizza place for my birthday, actually. It was the one we ate on the second floor. Had a nice little view.
And it was like Italian style, like small.
It was closer. They had like a real wood-fired oven.
Wood-fired, and the crust was, it was where the sauce and the cheese doesn't go all the way out to the crust.
It was significantly more expensive.
Yeah,
for
because
that
it was a nicer pizza.
Yeah.
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 Anyway, we have had some friends talking to you, I guess, about whether or not people are still wearing masks here in Japan, because they're not a big thing. They never were really that big of a thing in America.
We had like a few months.
Yeah.
Where they were like.
But yeah, I mean, flu season's definitely here.
Yeah. So the reason I had friends asking me about it is because I had sent a friend like a picture about I was at work, and all last week when I was at work, one of the entire grades, so Japanese high school, there are 3 grades. The middle grade, the second year students, they didn't come to school at all last week. And it's because they were on a school trip together and everyone got the flu. So I came in on Monday and like on the board in red, there were so many names, like
That's
maybe like 20 names written.
And right before the holidays too.
Yeah. So basically they all got the flu. And so they kept them home for, it was pretty much a full week. They didn't come to school at all. Unfortunately, one of the teachers that was also sick came back like a couple days later. So while the students weren't there, one of the teachers that was
maybe
sick
they waited
came back.
until they, didn't have a fever anymore.
I feel like more was the pressure of you need to be at work.
Well, that's unfortunate if they were feeling, it's
she
always
kind of didn't sound like super great. She was wearing a mask, but she did.
It's a bummer to have to work when you don't feel good.
I felt bad for her. But yeah, so I was like talking about this, and it was just an interesting note that in Japan they had, the kind of mindset. They're like, oh, we'll just keep that whole grade home. Everyone will miss school. We won't spread the sickness within the school and stop spreading it throughout the grade. So it was just really friendly.
And this wasn't it wasn't COVID, it was just flu.
No, there was one poor kid that had his name written. He was a third-year student, and I could read next to his name, it said Corona. And I was like, oh. Everyone else is like Infuru. But, so yeah, I mentioned it, and they asked me, they were like, oh, so are people still wearing masks over there? And I would definitely say that at least 50% of people, I feel like, still wear a mask all day,
I feel
every
like
day.
Even if it's not flu season, people still wear masks, though. I don't know if that will ever
I'm
really
saying,
change.
like, even, back in, like, September.
Yeah.
Before flu season was here, people were wearing masks. So, yeah, people are definitely still wearing masks. And now that it's flu season, even more people are wearing masks. And so, for instance, because all those kids were sick, I was wearing a mask anytime I left, like, the teacher's room, basically. So if I was in a classroom, I was wearing one because I hate being sick. And
it
probably
is nice. Well, I was just going to say, it's nice that there's no, like, stigma around masks where you can just, like, I haven't worn a mask probably in months, but if I did wear a mask tomorrow, somebody might ask me if I'm feeling sick, but it would just be more out of...
They wouldn't say anything.
Like a friend would ask, but
Maybe.
It would mostly be out of concern, but also they wouldn't care. And, you could wear one to either prevent being sick or because you're sick and you don't want to share it with anyone.
Yeah.
It's not like a statement or anything.
Yeah, it's not like you're trying to say something, and no one will say anything to you
cares.
about it. Yeah, like...
Which is kind of nice.
Yeah, so people here definitely still wearing masks, and I'll probably, especially now that it's like flu season, I'll probably go back to wearing one on like crowded public transportation, especially because there was a news story recently that in 2009 they set the record for like the outbreak of flu, and
in Japan,
and in 2023 this is the second fastest outbreak going on right now. So kind of like nationally it's like a big thing they're dealing with, and so just right now there's like a lot of flu in Japan. I haven't seen an article about COVID in a while, so I don't know about like corona cases in Japan, but right now the seasonal flu is pretty rough.
We didn't get our flu shots. I don't really know where.
I didn't get it last year and I didn't get one this year.
Yeah, I don't really know where I would get one. Like in America, you could just go to the grocery store even and get one.
Yeah, like at the Ingles, pharmacy. You could just go by CVS and get your shots. I feel like here we would have to go to just a local clinic.
Yeah, just a local clinic. But they're not doing it like at the grocery store or anything.
Yeah, and sometimes they do a weird like system where they mail out tickets and you can like redeem your ticket. That's what they did for the COVID shots.
Well, maybe they would do it at our local town hall, not the town hall, but the neighborhood community center. Sometimes they do little friendly things.
Maybe. I'm not as worried about it now because next week starts winter break.
Yeah.
And so I'll be away from the kids for almost like 2.5 weeks.
Think of the freedom.
I know. So I'm mostly worried about getting sick because of kids at school.
Mm-hmm.
And so since I won't be around them for so long, I'm hoping, the flu kind of like goes through the school and then
ends.
Yeah, and then ends. And then, yeah. So I'm not too worried about it.
Well, speaking of things you were talking about at school, one of your students is taking a college entrance exam, and you guys started talking about character length or like word count requirements on essays. And it's something that we hadn't thought about because in English, every word is very easy to distinguish on a piece of paper because there's a space between each word. And in Japanese, when you write, you don't put spaces between the different characters. So, yeah, we were like, well, I guess word count wouldn't really be a thing. And instead they do character count, which is interesting.
Yeah, so the student, he actually took the exam last weekend. I haven't seen him yet. But it's pretty interesting because it's I don't know what kind of university or community college or like technical school he's going to, but it's an entrance examination and includes an interview and then he has to write an essay. And so when I was asking the teacher, I was like, oh, what subjects are the test? The teacher was like, oh, there are no subjects. It's an interview. And then he does
just
the
an
essay.
Interview and just an essay. No, multiple choice questions or anything.
Nothing else. And
I guess that's when, nice.
I guess so. That's when she mentioned, oh, yeah, it's like an 800 character essay. And when she said that, that's what made me think like, oh, yeah, like you wouldn't do word count. You would do, I guess, character count.
It would be a bummer if you had to write something that had a katakana word because that would be like like 7 characters to spell it out instead of just using one kanji for the word.
That's true. Yeah, that's like a tricky thing. How do they distinguish,
Well, when I was looking into this, you can use these manuscript papers for essays or assignments, and it looks like a grid paper. Like instead of a lined sheet of notebook paper that you would use in, like when I took classes in school, it was just horizontal lines. This is like grid, like large grid paper, and they're called ginko yoshi, like manuscript paper. And you can get different size grids for the different requirements. So maybe it's like 20 by 20 grid.
Yeah, we saw one thing that said that's like pretty common, that you would have like a 400 character block. And so they would count it by 20 by 20. So like 20 characters across and then 20 rows of 20 characters.
So yeah, in that case, each katakana like symbol counts as one character.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful unless you're trying to fill up space.
Yeah, unless there's like, it's like a minimum and not like don't go over. But I don't know. Yeah, it's really interesting. I'll have to ask him. I'll see him.
And he was also talking about like what he was going to have to wear and stuff for his exam.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. They were talking about how like, oh, make sure you don't forget to wear your suit. You need to be like dressed up. And then the biggest thing that I feel bad about was his hair color. So he is, it's the night school, so he's like an older student. And so he's kind of like, the rules are a lot less lax. Like there's no school uniform.
A lot more lax.
A lot more lax. They can kind of do whatever they want. And they were talking about it, and he has like highlights in his hair. And they were talking about how like, oh, like, hair color is really important. And so they were talking about like if he needed to dye his hair to go
just
take
for the
this exam.
That's pretty intense.
Because they were like, well, you're supposed to have black hair. And I was like, really? Because then he asked the teacher to ask me like, oh, in America, like, do they care? And I was like, no.
Maybe
like,
for like a customer facing role, I have seen.
I think like 10 years ago, maybe. I think now.
It's less common now.
You could get away with whatever.
But for a job interview, depending on if it's a customer facing role or something, they might want you to look a certain way.
I think the anti-discriminatory like rules are so powerful now.
I think regardless.
I think if you had pink hair, you could go in and get a customer facing role like at a bank.
Probably. But regardless, for just a exam, you would never have to worry about hair color.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Because if you're just taking a test, you just show up and take the test.
Yeah, so the teacher was trying to tell him that she thinks he's probably okay because he's had that hair for a long time. So the photo of him that the school has seen, he would have had the same hair. So she was like, you probably don't need to change it because they know you already look like that. But she was kind of saying, like, in an ideal situation, you'd have black hair.
Oh, that's
like,
so stressful.
You wouldn't have highlights. Which also, this is just another thing, and I think I mentioned it before, like, you know, students aren't allowed to, like, paint their nails or, like, do anything. Like,
where?
At school.
At your school?
Yeah, like high schools. You're not supposed to paint your nails. You're not supposed to dye your hair.
I thought that was just, like, very strict, kind of antiquated high schools.
No, they're still high. Like, the teacher that I work with, when she was teaching in Noto, she told me that they still did the thing where they would, like, check your socks and your underwear.
Your underwear?
Yeah, it's supposed to be white. And
that
if it wasn't white,
too
it
invasive.
was, like, big deal.
Wow.
Yeah. Yes, that's where sometimes I talk to people and they'll, like, I'll say something about
That's
something.
a very rare case, I think. I mean, your school is not checking underwear.
I hope not. If they are, I'm not in on it. No one's ever checked me.
Yeah, no, that's
I wear black usually.
It's pretty intense. That's like that Calvin and Hobbes comic where he's all upset and he goes home and tells Hobbes that what's the point of wearing your favorite like lucky underpants if nobody ever asked to see them.
Oh yeah, that's true. But she said too that they would do stuff. They would, like, check your fingernail length and they would check, like, a lot of, like, hygiene things. And yeah, I mean, I would like to think that it's pretty rare, but I don't really know.
Wow.
It's just unfortunate that
there's such a difference, though. Like, it's so odd when it becomes hygiene versus personal preference. Like, okay, we're going to make sure everyone's washing their hands versus, like, when does that become, like...
And also the fact is, like, you're in high school.
Well, yeah. But it's just, yeah.
Yeah, but I was going to say there are some things like that I'll be talking to friends from back home, and I'll, like, casually mention something that's happening, and it'll, like, kind of freak people out. They'll be like, wait, like, that's happening in Japan? And I was like, yeah, and they have this... Not
everywhere. I mean, this is just one...
Like, that's an example.
Prefecture.
But they'll have this perception that Japan's this, you know, super modern, forward-thinking place, and then I'll mention something that's, like, pretty backwards, and they're like, wait a minute, like... But yeah, it's just interesting that...
Yeah, every country has their quirks.
Yeah, and then, yeah, they're still dealing with stuff like that. But yeah, that student was, like, really funny because he was like, oh, man, like, you Americans are so lucky.
Oh, I hope he doesn't have to dye his hair.
Me too. I'm surprised. I don't know if I'll see him. I usually only have him in class on Thursday. So I'll ask the teacher how it went on Tuesday. But...
Well, a big rabbit hole that we got into this week.
Rabbit hole I got into.
I follow the same
really
person
down there swimming around.
Yeah, so we both follow this person on, I guess, Instagram.
I've been following him longer, at least 2 or 3 years.
Okay, Zeb's kidding, kind of, but it's at Niigata0252, and Niigata with 2 eyes, and he's basically his page is about vintage cycling in Japan, and so we both were following him, and then independently we're like, oh, have you seen this? And we're like, oh yeah, I follow him too. And he had all these interesting posts on this thing called pass hunting in Japan on bikes, and this article by Native with 2 V's says that pass hunting is, quote, quite simply the sport of riding or carrying your bike over a mountain pass. It's popular in the mountainous regions of Japan and France. It's maybe more in line with cataloging butterflies and collecting rare mushrooms than modern road cycling. So if you're reading that thinking, what is that? I was too. And based on the photos that Niigata0252 was posting, it is like...
I think his name's Kentaro.
Oh, I don't know what his name is.
I don't know. I think when you go to Instagram, like, I was Googling this a lot today, and I kept seeing this. I think it was Kentaro, and I was like, oh, who's that? And I clicked on it, and it was like his. And I was like, oh.
Well, it looks like a mix of, like, mountaineering, like vintage hiking and backpacking, but then instead of a backpack, you have a bike, like, that you're actually carrying and not riding, because you're exploring by bike. And you're taking the term exploring so literally. Like, sometimes I'll say, like, oh, I'm exploring by bike, but I'm, like, always riding, and I try to not be, I try to not make a route that would be, unpassable by bike.
The goal is to not have to hike a bike.
Yeah.
Like, the goal is not to have to get off your bike to traverse an obstacle.
Yeah, on pass hunting, though, you're trying to do this kind of, like, first ascent type experience where you go until the road ends, and then you're planning on carrying your bike up and over the part that you can't bike across, and then on the other side, you'll finish on the bike, which is such an interesting and niche part of an already kind of niche sport. But I just am always surprised by how many different kind of splinters the world of cycling can get into. Like, there's so many different disciplines that you can take cycling into.
The one that always catches me off guard, this is a super aside, but is the like art cycling category.
I don't know that one.
Well, it's basically like synchronized swimming, but they do it on bikes.
Really?
Yeah. So they do the thing
so you
where
have
they
to have like a group of friends to do this with?
Yeah, and they do the things where they like dance but using a bike, so you can like make the bike stand up, and they do the thing where they like balance on the wheels and like ride it around. And
that's cool. I thought what you were saying is where you make a Strava route and the map is, it looks like a photo after you've...
there's a guy that's famous for that, and he lives in Kanazawa.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he works for or he's an ambassador for like Strava Japan.
That's cool.
But he's a Strava artist, and he's predominantly a runner, but he lives in Kanazawa, and he does all these, like I saw him recently, he was practicing his dragon for the new year.
Oh, that's cool.
So he was like doing a run that looked like a dragon.
That would take a long time to look at roads and then plan out a route that makes a picture out of already existing roads. I mean, I guess you could cut through someone's yard or something, but there's only so much you can do.
Yeah. But anyway.
So back to pass hunting, this new form of biking that we learned about.
It's already not popular anymore. But
so I guess that's why he's featuring it on his Instagram page, because it's this kind of vintage style.
Yeah, so really what this guy does, and it's really interesting, he really focuses on, from kind of like the late 60s through the 80s, there was a cycling magazine, and I can't remember the name, but he must have been a subscriber, or he owns tons of them, but he kind of goes through the archives of this cycling magazine, and he'll post, old articles or like cool photos, or he also focuses on like retro ads. Mm-hmm. So when he finds like a cool TV ad or a cool TV picture, he'll post it on his Instagram. And I think it's really interesting because it's an aesthetic that a lot of people are into, and I think it is neat. And it's also interesting because it's like a window into a period of time in cycling that's aesthetically interesting, but through the lens of a different culture. Mm-hmm. So not only is it like 60s to 80s vintage cycling, it's 60s to 80s Japanese flavor vintage cycling.
Like for pass hunting. Like one of the ads that he posted was a bike that was built for doing this pass hunting style of riding. And he said it was kind of the origin of the Japanese gravel bike, where you would hike with it because they had taken one of the bottle cages off, so it was easier to carry over your shoulder while you were hiking with your bike. And yeah, that's just so niche. I mean, I don't know why you couldn't just put your arm through the bike frame.
Yeah.
But
like, it's a very interesting perspective. But he also does other stuff. Like, remember I showed you the ad of the Panasonic frame builder, that it's like the guy from Africa that's super tall, and everyone in Japan's like, look how freakishly tall he is.
Yeah, it's a bit of an outdated ad.
Yeah, it's a little kind of like,
But it was about how Panasonic would make custom frames no matter how tall you were, I guess.
Something like that. But then I got really into this because so sometimes you'll read something, and specifically for me, like with cycling and the history of cycling, it's like a topic that I'm really interested in. And so then you read something and people present this idea to you that, and there's also this common idea that, like gravel right now is really popular. But people kind of like to hate on it because they're like, well, it was cool before gravel was cool. Like, we used to do this. And it's kind of like, okay, well, did you know before that all the roads in the Tour were gravel roads because they didn't have pavement back then? So there are funny ideas like that. So some of these articles that were like spin-offs from this guy's Instagram talking about pass hunting made these like bold claims about like, did you know that Japan had mountain biking before America? And they like had all these funny claims that, from my personal interest, I was like, oh, I'd like to know.
It's hard to pin down like who invented what when though.
Yeah. So then I ended up like in this rabbit hole of like trying to find out like the history of pass hunting, like where did this originate?
Of bikes in Japan.
Well, yeah, then it kind of turned into the history of like cycling in Japan, because then I got interested because I was like, oh yeah, like when did this happen? So here's a brief timeline that includes, it's mostly focused on pass hunting, but just for some niche interest, I'll mention some other dates in here that we can talk about. So basically, for
bikes in general.
Bikes in general. For those that didn't know, the bicycle was invented in 1817.
In Germany.
In Germany, which is contested also because
they're
designs from Da Vinci and some of his students from the 1500s, where they're designs of something that looks like a bicycle, but apparently no one knows if they actually built it.
Yeah,
they think they might have just drawn it.
At some point, it's kind of like, who invented the wheel? Like, it's hard to know if they got simultaneously invented or if somebody was influenced by another person.
Kind of. And
but then when was it brought to Japan?
So that's the interesting thing, is that I hadn't really thought about this. So Japan had, they were closed off to the rest of the world. So they didn't have any of this stuff. And so it wasn't until 1868, which admittedly is only 50 years after the invention of the bicycle, that the bicycle was brought to Japan.
The Meiji Restoration.
Yeah, there was the Meiji Restoration. And that came at the end of, and I'm forgetting, the Tokugawa period, which was 1603 to 1868, where for some reason there was a ban on wheeled vehicles. So there were no wheeled vehicles in all of Japan.
What would you use instead? Just like drag
a horse stuff? I don't know. So from 1603 to 1868, I didn't read about why.
That's such a long time.
Yeah, no wheeled vehicles.
But hundreds of years.
Listen, I don't. That's devil magic. We don't need it in our Japan.
We'll have to do a whole other aside on why.
Yeah, so that's a thing. So in 1868, the Meiji Restoration ended the Tokugawa period, and so bicycles were brought into Japan. And coincidentally, like 1880 to 1890, that's when the safety bicycle was invented, which is what you imagine when you think of a modern bicycle. So that's really, the first bicycle was called a velocipede.
It's like the one where you stand over it and run,
It was basically like a strider bike for adults.
Which is so funny that's
stupid.
Now we've gone like full circle because now babies have striders again.
Yeah, well, I guess adults needed to learn how to ride a bike, so they started with the strider, and then they...
Imagine riding a bike as an adult. That would be really hard to learn. Props to anyone who's an adult that learns to ride a bike when you're an adult.
Like learn how to swim or something, I guess.
Yeah, that would be hard.
So anyway, and this is where I got into a side rabbit hole. So in 1896, the rickshaw reached its peak time as a transportation device in Japan, because remember there's a ban on wheeled vehicles. So it wasn't until 1896
they could bring the rickshaw back or start it.
Yeah, so the rickshaw hit its peak, and there were 210,000 active rickshaws across the country.
Does a rickshaw have to carry a person?
I don't know.
Or can it just be any kind of wheeled wagon that you're pulling behind you?
So I imagine it can be any wheeled wagon, because rickshaw originates from the Japanese word jinrikisha, which is human-powered vehicle.
Human, riki, power, sha, vehicle.
Yeah, so human-powered vehicle.
I see.
And this is where I thought it was really funny, because in this article I was reading, it was like, oh, the rickshaw was invented in Japan. And so I was like, oh, I didn't know that. I always assumed it was, when I think of rickshaw, I think of, I don't know, Vietnam or something. I don't know why. But I think of Southeast Asia, mainland Asia. So then I ended up looking this up on Wikipedia.
That's probably very contested.
Yeah, the very first line is, the rickshaw was invented in France in the 17th century.
Oh, I don't know about that. Maybe.
So they said that it wasn't widely used in France, but it was invented in France in a few different forms. It didn't quite look like the rickshaw that Japan used.
I could see that as being one of those things that got independently invented in different places.
So that's what they say, but it is kind of well, that's a 200-year, wheeled vehicles were still banned in Japan in the 17th century. So France was over there rickshawing around.
Well.
And then I thought it was even funnier because I kept reading about it. And it was although Japan helped popularize the rickshaw is actually a UNESCO Intangible Heritage Item in Bangladesh. Because I guess that's where they're still mostly, I don't know. Anyway, off the rickshaw topic.
Fast forward to the 1900s. And
so early 1900s, the derailleur was invented.
Wow.
Big fan. But the big thing back in Japan, in 1956, there was a bicycle boom. And so post-war Japan, a lot of the infrastructure had been destroyed in the war.
And we don't have time to get into it, but during the war, they actually had soldiers on fleets of bikes.
Yeah, but this was worldwide. So there was this, they were known as bomber bicycles. Apparently paratroopers from the United States, when they jumped out of airplanes, they would take bikes with them.
Like strap a bike on their back?
Yeah, so when they landed, they were like mobile.
Interesting.
So they would jump out of airplanes with bikes and hit the ground running.
I feel like that could be, you know, I mean, that's kind of a dark thing to turn into a sport, but I feel like that could be like a rich people sport, like like jumping out of a plane. What is that called? Skydiving.
The mountain passes are not high enough anymore.
Yeah,
We're going to the
like
sky.
skydiving with a bike, and then when you land, you bike from there.
Maybe.
Like the new ultra sport.
Yeah. So post-war Japan, 1956, there's a bicycle boom because the infrastructure destroyed during the war. It's difficult to get around. And then also, I think during this period, there were other earthquakes and fires. And so there was difficulty getting like the infrastructure up and going. So most people turned to bicycles because they're easy and cheap to manufacture. And yeah, you can get around on them. You can pick them up. You can go over obstacles.
Mm-hmm.
And
you don't have to pay for gas or repairs.
Yeah, no gas or anything.
Cheaper repairs.
So then in 1958, this guy, and I forget his name, he writes a book. And his book is about mountain climbs in the Kanto region. However, what makes his book unique is he's doing a lot of these climbs with his bike.
So that's where pass hunting in Japan kind of...
So people say this is the origin of pass hunting. And he mentions specifically, you know, you should carry everything needed for survival via bike. So he's on this crazy bike, like loaded down with gear. And he even talks about using like crampons for climbing. And so essentially what he's doing is rock climbing, but taking a bike with him.
So interesting. Is that because he's like biking out to the base of things and then summiting them, and then when he gets to the bottom, he has to like get back?
See, I don't know. That's like my thought is maybe he was riding his bike to the base of a climb, and then he was climbing, but then for some reason he was going up and over the mountain instead of going back down to his bike.
It's very independent. I know that like now we're setting all these records and things, and people are doing incredible like free solos and all these like really impressive adventure feats, but just thinking about like previously in history when people were just like, I'm gonna go out there and just walk up Everest, like no modern gear, no knowledge of what was really up there.
Yeah, these people were roughing it.
People are very brave in the past.
That's all they had. That's all they knew.
Maybe they didn't know enough to be afraid.
Yeah, so this guy, he writes this book, and it kind of becomes this like modern like Bible for this type of like adventure, this type of riding. But it's not like super popular at the time. And then this is just an interesting note, but in the 1960s, the 23 wards of Tokyo are established and they're a thing. But I didn't know, so many of the roads are still dirt in Tokyo in the 60s.
I mean, that kind of makes sense though. It's not that long after the end of the Second World War.
Yeah, not that long after. And then it's just interesting to think about like, yeah, in the 60s, Tokyo is still mostly dirt roads. Like in the heavy populated areas, there's asphalt, and of course it's paved. So the countryside, even in Tokyo, used to feel kind of like right there. Like you could get to it easily. Of course, now that's not really the case. But it really wasn't until the 1960s that the bicycle in Japan becomes this cultural fixture. And they like to contrast this with in Europe. A lot of countries are specifically putting money into cycling infrastructure, and they're trying to encourage people to use bikes, and they're, you know, really going for it with cycling. Meanwhile, Japan is rapidly building car-specific infrastructure, and they're trying to convince people to use cars. I guess maybe kind of like what we were doing in America. But the affordability and accessibility of cycling meant that the bike hung around as a popular mode of transportation, even when the government was trying to get people into cars and get them off of bikes.
And I guess that's why there's so much money that was put into road transportation or road infrastructure.
I guess so.
And like, even though I feel really safe riding my bike on almost any road, I mean, of course not the toll roads because those are, you know, expressly made for cars, but any other road, there's often not a bike lane, but it doesn't matter. Like, I feel like the cars are fine sharing the road.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is the cars in Japan are so small and the speed limits are so slow compared to the United States.
But there are more people just out riding city bikes. I mean, compared to America, it's probably very common to somebody who is coming from Europe, like the Netherlands or something. Or maybe even from
an American city like Boston. I don't really know. Or like Seattle.
Well, yeah, we're from the countryside of America, and you can't ride very far on a bike without feeling like you're out of place.
Yeah, so all of this is leading up to the 1970s. There's, of course, the global oil crisis. The environmental movement's been building momentum. And kind of in the same decade, Japan kicks off one of the first of many like domestic tourism campaigns called Discover Japan.
Where they're still doing that.
Yeah, they definitely still are. They're trying to encourage Japanese people to explore rural Japan. So this is kind of like all in this movement, and it's kind of like in this moment where pass hunting becomes like culturally popular for some niche cyclists. It becomes this thing. Yeah, in the 70s. So if you look at that guy's Instagram page,
most of his stuff is from the 70s.
The first article is from 1978, and then there's a second article from 1981. So if you're thinking, like, by the time they're writing an article about it, it's popular enough to write about. So maybe like mid-70s, this is when people are actually doing pass hunting. So they think that it becomes popularized due to cycling lifestyle magazines. So it becomes even more popular. And it's just really interesting because also by this point, they're starting to manufacture bikes specifically for this idea of pass hunting. But it's the kind of interesting thing because like most things, they're the Puritans. So I found this blog and I was reading this guy's blog, and he's very much a Puritan. And he thinks that like the 1958 book that guy wrote is
like all you should be doing.
That's pass hunting. And so he blames by this times in the 70s and 80s, pass hunting has become watered down.
It's too casual.
Yeah, it's become watered down.
People aren't trying to summit mountains anymore. They're just trying to go out there, ride some gravel.
Yeah, the influence of international cycling culture, predominantly mountain bike and cyclocross by this point.
Yeah, because in the 80s, mountain biking became a thing.
Yeah, so the first purpose-built mountain bike was in 1974. So in the late 60s, early 70s, there were dudes in California on old bikes made for mailmen riding mountain bikes. Because they were called Schwinn balloon tire bikes, so they had abnormally large tires.
But I don't think the first market sold mountain bike was until the 80s.
No, so the Joe Breeze manufactured the first mountain bike in 1974.
Joe Breeze?
Yeah.
Is that a shop name or
no,
a guy?
That's his name, and then his brand became Breezer.
Oh.
And so I don't think they really caught on mass-produced market until 1981. But in the early to mid 70s, this guy was making them, I guess maybe in his garage. Because he won a bike race on a bike that he made specifically for mountain biking in 1975.
Well, so that's a whole other thing from
anyway,
pass hunting. But why is there this concept of pass hunting in Japan that's so similar to pass hunting in France? So
that's where the water's super muddy. So there's this idea that the author of this blog, he really jumps through a bunch of hoops to try and prove that pass hunting is this original idea to Japan and that the Japanese invented pass hunting. And he even goes so far to say that, okay, so while they're doing this in France and England, in France it's called cyclo-alpinism, and in England it's called pass storm. And so he's trying to point out that the French are worried about coals and worried about doing this over 2,000 meters. And, in England, they don't really have mountains. So what they're doing isn't really, he jumps through all these hoops.
Well, I mean, I can appreciate that two different cultures maybe invented separately something very similar. Yeah, maybe. It's hard to invent one thing in a vacuum.
Yeah, so it's just really interesting because a lot of the stuff on social media now is talking about how Japan invented pass hunting. And I think a lot of it goes back to this guy's Instagram, which is really interesting because he happened to just post these photos. And I do think there is a lot that makes pass hunting unique in Japan, kind of like our pizza. There are different palates, so there are different flavors in different parts of the world. So I wouldn't take it away from Japan and say that they probably do it differently from the way they do it in other parts of the world, especially at that time period.
Well, and the geography is different, so that just the nature of it is different then. But if you are listening to this and you're like, pass hunting, that sounds incredible. I've been waiting for a sport that combines alpine hiking and carrying a bike.
That's another contentious thing.
What?
In that guy's blog, he talks about like the definition of sport and is pass hunting sport because you're not doing
it's a
it
lifestyle.
you're not doing it for competition. You're doing it for like the pursuit of the like. It's just like any like Puritan belief about some. You know, when people try to make something sound really lofty.
Well, that's his idea. That's fine.
And it's totally fine.
But anyway, if you want to try something like this, there actually is a group that puts on these events where you have to ride a vintage bike and vintage clothes and really kind of reenact this time period on bikes to get that feel. They're called Eroica. Is that right? And I think it's a French company, which is, again, muddies the waters. Oh, Italian.
Yeah,
because
I think it started in the Chianti region in Italy, riding the Strade Bianche.
Spain. Oh, no, then never mind.
Yeah, we were over there pounding some Chianti wine, which in Kanazawa you can go to, I think it's Chianti is the name of the restaurant.
Oh.
They sell wine.
Clearly I'm not a sommelier.
Yeah, but they do this thing where, it's like they have each region, so they do it in regions throughout the world. There's one here in Japan.
Yeah, on the Izu Peninsula. The next one's May 2024, May 11th.
Yeah, so
you have to bring your own vintage bike.
You can maybe rent one, but each region has their own like rules. Apparently there's one region that does it like mega historic, and your bike has to be from like 1900 to 1910.
Wow.
And you have to, that's like the vintage they go for. So some regions have different
really
vintages.
Specific. That's like a cool old car show kind of thing.
I think it's a similar idea.
Wow.
Yeah. But yeah, it's really fascinating. And you could buy, so one of the 1970s like Panasonic Pass Hunter bikes would fit. You could take that to Eroica because it's the right vintage.
Oh, really?
I think most events your bike has to be from before like 1978 or something like that.
Interesting. But then also the clothing. As of 2023, they now require helmets.
In Japan.
Oh, okay.
I don't think every region does that, but in Japan, they require you to wear a modern helmet.
But everything else has to be like clothing to fit that time period.
Yeah.
So.
And if you want a modern experience, there's actually, and we can give a link to this. So in 1972, there was a French pass hunter club, and it's called Saint Cols, and it's a French club, and it's the club of 100 cols. And a col is essentially COLS. It's essentially like a saddle. So if you think about two peaks, the col is the pass in between the two.
Oh, and I just thought it was a hill.
No, so specifically it's the pass in between two peaks. And
what is that word, French?
Yeah. And the club is for people that have climbed 100 different cols. And they have a list of 100 in France that you can target, but you can be anywhere in the world. And it's funny because they're like an honor-based society. Oh. So you can create your own list of like cols that you've done. And once you hit 100, you can like mail it into them along with your application fee. And they'll send you back like a certificate, and you become like a member of the society.
Wow. What an elite society. So do you think someone's made like 100 passes in Japan?
Probably. It seems like a pretty, I bet some Japanese people would be into this. There was a really funny blog I found specifically about that, and someone was, they had like done a col it was like Alabama or something, and there was even a sign at the top of it, and it was like 154 feet or something, which is like 35 meters.
Yeah.
But it technically counted as a col. So,
I don't know about that. That's probably where that Puritan guy would be like upset that you're ruining the nature of pass hunting.
Yeah.
By watering down the effort. And actually, I think it's Eroica. Their tagline is "The beauty of fatigue and the thrill of conquest," which is a pretty intense tagline, inspirational even.
I mean, it's fascinating, really. It does. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that does get me a little fired up, though.
What?
I don't know, just like the history. Like I'm into.
You're excited about the history of bikes.
I'm excited about the history of bikes, and I like that other people like it so much that they create these global events where they essentially cosplay as
Yeah, I had no
a
idea
1920s.
that was a thing. I knew that reenactment stuff is a thing, but I didn't know reenacting on bikes. I mean, that could be your new retirement hobby to look forward to.
No, because unfortunately, so I would try it once for the experience just to see what it's like. But for me, and I think everyone does this, like our parents with music or people with cars, they really like a certain vintage. So they get stuck, like, in that decade. You know,
just like modern bikes?
I really like the aesthetic of modern cycling. Like, even now, like, disc brakes on bikes, I used to hate it. But there are some people, that always be like, well, road bikes should have rim brakes, and that's what it looks like. I just really like the aesthetic of modern cycling, like, right now, in the current era.
I wonder if I ask you in 10 years if you'll like 10 years from now bikes, though.
It'd be tricky because I can remember when disc brakes came to road bikes and I was not a fan. Like, I thought it looked dumb. I was like, that's stupid. I don't understand. And then it was like 3 years later, I rode a bike with disc brakes and I was like, oh, this is pretty cool.
Maybe you just like the latest science and it's
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think I just like the aesthetic of, like, modern. Like, I like the kind of cutting edge.
That's not aesthetic then. That's just like, you just like technology.
No, but it's because, like, even so, the bike that I really liked 10 years ago, I don't like the way it looks anymore.
Oh.
Like, I like the way my current road bike looks. So it's kind of, I don't know what you would call that, but yeah.
Well, the last thing about bikes that we wanted to mention was city bikes in Japan. And we've mentioned before, a Mama-chyari is what you call a city bike. Kind of what I've always been told is it's short for mama chariot, like a mom bike.
Yeah, and I remember we joked about that. We used to joke about, like, oh yeah, it's like
my Mama-chyari, and it's in katakana, like, for loan words. So we were thinking that. But then you were talking to your coworker, and she was saying that the chari is the sound a bell makes, like a bike bell. I
asked her because I had this other coworker once that he called it a Chyarinko. And I was like, oh, I don't know what a Chyarinko is. And he was like, oh, like a Mama-chyari. And I was like, oh, okay. And I asked him, I was like, so why do you call it a Chyarinko? And he was like, oh, I think you call it that because it's chari is like the sound of the bell.
There are a lot of monopoetic words in Japanese.
A ton. And so I asked another coworker, I was like, what do you call it? And she was like, oh, I call it a Chyarinko. I was like, oh, why? And she's like, oh, because of the sound a bell makes. So I asked her, I was like, oh, is Mama-chyari like the same chari? Like, they're the same? And she was like, yeah. She's like, it's the sound a bell makes. So
I feel like most younger people call them Mama-charis. Like, if you went to a shop and you were asking for a Mama-chyari, everyone would know what you were talking about.
I think at some point there's like a generational gap that both of my coworkers were probably like late 50s, early 60s, and they both called it a Chyarinko. But I do think that most people nowadays call it a Mama-chyari. So at some point, that style of bicycle became synonymous with, like, a mom running errands or, like, going to the grocery store. And it became like, oh, it's a Mama-chyari because, like, moms ride that. Where it used to be universally known as a Chyarinko. It was just a bike and it sounded like that. So yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. Yeah, I could see
how maybe, like, like a high school guy or something who has to ride a utilitarian bike to school or work, maybe he wouldn't want it to be, like, called a Mama-chyari.
Yeah, I don't know.
Just because it has a basket on the front or something.
Yeah, I guess. But I do think that's kind of, like, stuck. That's just what it is now. Which makes, I don't know, it's interesting that it shifted at one point from Chyarinko to Mama-chyari. But supposedly, unless someone can send us a link to prove otherwise, I've been told by 2 Japanese individuals that, yeah, it's from the sound the bell makes. I really did think it was like a mom chariot, which is kind of funnier, but...
Well, I mean, I think it could be both. Like,
could be.
Could be that. Because sometimes I'm told something by one Japanese person, and I'm like, oh, they must be true.
Yeah.
And then a different Japanese person will tell me
They'll
something
tell you, like,
else.
the opposite, and you're like, what?
Yeah, so everybody has their own, like, experiences, I guess.
Yeah.
But, do you have a word of the week?
I do. So it's a katakana word, and it's not super exciting.
Oh.
But for those who don't know, and I think I've mentioned it before, in Japan, Pokemon have different names most of the time than the English translated name. And
Except for Pikachu.
Except for Pikachu, and there are a few others. But did you also know It's not a Pokeball.
No.
No, it's a Monster Ball.
Oh, Monster Ball?
So it's a Monster Ball.
Is it Monsta? Monsuta?
It's a Monsuta Baru.
Monsuta Baru. Yeah.
But it's interesting because it's not
Monster Ball.
Baru, it's Boru. Monster Boru.
I guess that sounds more similar to ball.
I guess so. But I thought it was interesting just because I was like talking to some of my students about Pokemon, and it made me realize like, oh yeah, like I would call it a Pokeball.
Yeah.
What's it called here? And it's not a Pokeball.
That is interesting. I guess because they're pocket monsters, and then that's the Monster Ball.
Yeah, so you put the pocket monsters in your Monster Ball. Yeah.
Well, my word is different. Nothing to do with Pokemon, but it's actually something that you wish we had. It's danro. Do you want to guess?
Oven?
Close.
Oh,
it's
really?
a fireplace.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a danro. And my friend and I went to a cafe that had a fireplace inside, and like with a real wood stove fireplace. And
like, was it a wood stove or like an open fireplace, like a Western, like your parents have and my mom has?
It was not a wood stove, but it was a fireplace that you put real wood into, but then you shut the door on. It was like built into a wall, but it had a glass door kind of thing, so it wasn't an open fireplace.
It's kind of like a wood stove built into a wall.
Kind of, but you wouldn't cook anything. It was just for warmth.
Yeah.
There was no way to cook with it.
Well, it just makes me wonder because it's like, I can see in the notes it's a Japanese word and it has a kanji. But there's also like the iori, which is like the hearth in the middle of a room.
Oh, yeah.
Which is also like a fireplace.
Yeah, true. That one's more like a pit.
Yeah, so I was wondering about this one.
This is more like a Western fireplace. Like when I think of a fireplace in a wall. Yeah, I don't know the exact difference between the two.
Yeah, because, when I think in America, I think of like you have a wood stove, but then you also have like an open fireplace. Which I guess is like different from the Japanese fireplace.
A danro is a fireplace in some regard.
But I do wish we had one.
Yeah.
I just really miss the smell of like wood fires, and it's really nice when you have like a fire going and it's a chilly morning or chilly evening. So.
Yeah. Well, thanks for listening again this week to a kind of rambly episode on bike history and pass hunting and other random things like pizza and character count.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff over here.
Anything to add about any of those topics, we'd love to hear about it at ramblingramsbothams@gmail.com. Or if you just want to say hi, that's fine too. And yeah, thanks for listening again.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Bye.
Bye.